Okay, I am doing the axial skeleton. I'm going to start with the cranial bones. Right here first is the frontal bone. Then here we have the parietal bone, which is here on the side. And then we have, in the back, we have the occipital bone. Okay, next we have the internal occipital protuberance, which should be in the back of the skull here. Okay, we have the external view, which is the temporal mandibular joint, which would be the top of the mandible, which would be here. Then we have the mastoid process, which will be here, kind of next to the temporal bone. And then we have the stylo process, which would be like a little bone coming out just before the mandible, which you really can't see here. Then we have the external acoustic meatus, which would be this little side right here. We have the squamous part, which would be between the temporal bone and the parietal bone. And then we have the internal view, which would be the meatus part of the temporal bone, which would be right, basically the temporal bone, which houses the organ for hearing, which is the internal acoustic meatus, which has a passageway for cranial nerves, which will all be basically in the temporal bone. Then we have the sphenoid, which is right next to the eyes and the temporal bone, so which will be in here, which will be external, but we can't see in there. Should be basically like here. We have the superior orbital fissure, which would be inside basically, because it's an internal view, but it has passageway for the nerves. The nerves passes through. We have the ethmoid. We have the crista galli, which protects from orbiform plate of the ethmoid bone. Crista galli is right behind the eyes in the middle of the ethmoid, so right here. And then we have the cribriform plate, which would house the crista galli, which all of it lays basically in the frontal part of the cranium, and it separates the brain from the nasal cavities. The sutures. We have the cornel suture, which will be with the frontal bone, and the parietal bone, which will be here. Next we have the sagittal bone, which will be basically down the middle with the left and right parietal bone. And then we have the lambdoid suture, which will be in the back, which would be with the parietal bone and the occipital bone, which would be here. And then we have the squamous suture, which would be with the parietal bone and the temporal bone, which would be basically right here. Okay, next we have the facial bones, which okay, we have the nasal, which will be here, the zygomatic arch, which will be here, which is formed by the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone. We have the ethmoid, which will be basically in here, which is internal. We have the vomer, which is here, and the vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, it forms the vomer arch. The internal nasal conchae, which is inside the nose, on the side basically over here. And the mandible is here, and this is the mandible body. The vertebral column, we have the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the pelvic. In the cervical column, the cervical vertebrae, we have 7 vertebrae, which is basically at the top, connecting to the neck. It allows head rotation. The cervical process is faster in a human body, which means it forms faster than any other column. In the thoracic column, we have 12 vertebrae, which will be basically here. The spinous process, which will be here. If you go on the back, will be the spinous process here. Oh wait, you can't even see it. Which will be here. The transverse process will be here, inside. You can't see really. The intervertebral foramen will be the spaces in between, right here. And in between the spaces, what passes through is the spinal nerves. And then we have the body, or the centrum, which will be basically the spine. The intervertebral disc will be these lines here. Okay. Then we have the lumbar vertebrae, which has 5 vertebrae. We have the sacrum, which will be here. It is fused with 5 vertebrae. We have the coccyx, which is the bottom piece here. Okay, and then we have the sternum, which is basically here. We have the membrane, which is here. We have the body, which is just basically the sternum. We have the xiphoid process, which is this bottom piece here sticking out. And then we have the jugular notch, which is here, top. The ribs, we have the true and false ribs. We have 7 true, which are the first 7, and false would be 8 through 12. The floating ribs would be these 11 and 12, which are not touching the sternum or the rest of the ribs. We have the head, neck, and tubercle oviribs. The head of the ribs, it articulates with the bodies, or adjacent to the thoracic vertebrae. We have the neck, which articulates with the transverse process of an inferior vertebrae, and the tubercle, which is just here.